One of my favorite quotes from Henry Ford: "The only real mistake is the one from which we will learn nothing." So our plan today is to learn about postmortems, learn how we can learn from our failure, particularly using the data. So who am I? Well, I'm Jason. I work at a company called Datadog. You might have noticed the rather large crowd that we had just a few minutes ago downstairs. We were giving away a Nintendo Switch. Unfortunately, if you missed that, you didn't get the gaming console. But Datadog's a great platform. I like working there. I work as a technical writer and evangelist, which means that I get to read through all of our code, figure out what it does, and make it accessible to people like you, developers that use our product. I also get to fly around the world and talk about interesting things around the DevOps space, how we learn from failures, how we build resilient systems. I'm also a whiskey hunter, so if you like whiskey and you know of any good places around town, let me know later. Datadog is a SaaS-based monitoring platform. We handle trillions of points of data every day. That comes to roughly somewhere around 40 million points of data every second. And we are hiring. So if you're interested in doing creative, challenging work around monitoring, building monitoring systems, building resilient systems, and learning from failure, then check out our site, jobs.datadoghq.com. So if you actually did decide to apply for a job at Datadog, one of the things that you would get is our internal developer guide. And you'd see this statement at the very beginning of it. And it says that the problems that we work on are hard, and they often don't have obvious, clean-cut solutions. So we have to cultivate our troubleshooting skills, no matter what area we work in. And this applies not only to Datadog, but it applies to, I believe, everything that we're all working on today. Everybody in this room is working on complex systems, whether or not you think you are, from the smallest websites, web developers, all the way to people building huge distributed apps. We're working in a world that we just have complex systems, and they're not always technical. So we do need to cultivate our troubleshooting skills. This has led to the rise of a thing called blameless postmortems within the DevOps world. Blameless postmortems was a coin termed by a guy named John Allspaw, who used to work at Etsy. And the notion here wasn't that people weren't necessarily at fault, or that we should just, walk away and not take responsibility. The notion here was that when we're trying to learn from failure, if we accuse people, if we start to point fingers, people don't tell us the truth, and we can't learn from them. So let's take a step back, and why did this come up within the realm of DevOps? Well, DevOps, as defined by these two gentlemen, Damon Edwards and John Willis. John was actually here this morning on this stage speaking, but they defined DevOps as CAMs: culture, automation, metrics, and sharing. Oftentimes when we talk about DevOps, we hear people say the DevOps tool chain, or my DevOps tool, or my DevOps automation. But it's something that we have to understand, that DevOps isn't a tool. It does encompass some automation, but a colleague of mine likes to point out these gentlemen, the Amish. They can do a lot with no modern tooling. The Amish refuse to use electricity, and so they build everything with hand tools, and they can get a lot done. They can build giant barns in a single day just by working together, and that really emphasizes the notion behind DevOps. If DevOps is there to make us work and move faster as organizations, to build better things, it's not about the tools, it's about us as people. And once we have that culture figured out, once we have that culture and the sharing and the collaboration, then the tools really just are tools. They're things that help us move just a little bit faster. So you can imagine that putting together a barn and having that communication and then giving people power tools, how much more quickly would they be able to move? But you could also imagine, on the flip side, if I had a guy up in a crane like this, and communication was broken, and he wasn't communicating with people on the ground, well, he would be dropping some serious payloads on people's heads. It would be a disaster. So if we're thinking about DevOps and learning and having that culture and that sharing, when it comes to postmortems, we're really focusing on the culture and on the sharing aspect. So if your traditional postmortem process looks more like this, put away your pitchforks, start thinking about how we can actually learn from our postmortems. Now, just a few resources, and I will share these slides later. I'll have a link. But John Allspaw's blog post on the original Blameless Postmortems is there. It's on the Etsy blog. And a gentleman named Dave Zweibach actually wrote a fantastic book as well. That's a link to that, so you can go and download it afterward. So culture and sharing are really great. But with CAMs, we know that metrics is a part of that. And that's, I think, what we're all here to learn about, is how can we apply data to what we're learning about our failures. Unfortunately, I think a lot of people can resonate with the honest status page here. So at Datadog, we like to say that collecting data is cheap, but not having it when you need it can be very expensive. Just to give you some numbers, there's a research group called the Aberdeen Group. They've done a little bit of research onto how much money that we lose for downtime. For small companies, they estimate the loss at roughly $8,000 per hour. For medium-sized companies, that number jumps up to $215,000 every hour. And for large companies, if we're thinking about enterprise-scale companies, that number is close to $1 million every hour. So when you think of how much it costs to store data, if I set up an S3 bucket and just start dumping data there, it costs me roughly $30 a month to store 10 gigabytes of data. Compare that cost, even if I scale it up and replicate it over multiple availability zones, if I'm in an enterprise and losing $1 million an hour, those are two vastly different scales. So you do understand that you need to collect the metrics in order to determine what went wrong and to learn from your failures. But not all metrics are created equal. You can't just gather all the metrics and assume that you have everything. There are really 4 good qualities of metrics that you need when you're gathering data about your systems. And the first is that they have to be well understood. And there's sort of 2 components to this. But I'll give the analogy here that is the blind men and the elephant. There's an old parable of a group of blind men, and they're introduced to an elephant, and each of them grabs onto a portion of the elephant. And one guy grabs onto the leg and says that the elephant is like a tree because this big leg. And another one grabs onto the trunk and says that the elephant is like a snake because it's flexible and it's thick like that. When it comes to your metrics need to be well understood. If you're grabbing onto a portion of your systems, you need to understand not only what that means, what those metrics mean about that portion of your system, but you need to also see that within the larger scope of your system. So when it comes to your monitoring tools, you need to be pulling everything that you can into one single place so that everybody on your team and across your organization, whether they be ops or developers or even business people, can gather the metrics that they need and see it as a complete whole. The second quality that we need for our metrics is that they have to have sufficient granularity. I think we inherently understand this when we look at things like the Olympics. Last year, the Olympics happened, and one of my favorite events is the men's 50-meter freestyle. It's one of the fastest events in the Summer Games. The races, as we can see here, it got a little bit of cutoff, but they're roughly 21 seconds. So the US won gold at about 21.4, I think 21.4 seconds flat. Silver ended up getting in at 21.41. So we understand that for this particular race, we needed hundredths of a second. And unfortunately, it got cut off, but even at 100th of a second, we could see that in 6th place, there was actually a tie between Brazil and the Republic of South Africa. When it comes to our metrics, we understand that it's very similar, that we need to divide time down in order to see what's going on. So if we look at our metrics, well, here's an example. We've got a peak that's happening at roughly 2:06 and 14 seconds. And this CPU spike happens, and it's about 46%. So not outrageous, but it's definitely quite a spike. If we decide that our granularity isn't going to be seconds, that our granularity is going to be whole minutes, well, then not only does that average it out, it shifts that time forward to just being 2:06 p.m., but it also means that our peak is now 36%. So we're losing information, and we're skewing it. If we shift this to 5-minute increments, then you can see that we no longer have a peak. Everything's been averaged down to just 12%. And again, our time is shifted to the start of a 5-minute increment. So if you're having an outage, and you're looking at your metrics, and you're looking at your dashboards, and you see some sort of issue, and you're trying to remediate this, and let's take a look at our logs to see what our application is generating. Are you supposed to look at 205? Are you supposed to look at 206? How do you know where to actually look? So your granularity really, really matters when it comes to figuring out what's going wrong in your systems and learning from them. The third quality of metrics that we absolutely need is for them to be tagged and filterable. As we start to build more complex systems and geo-distribute them and break them up into multiple tiers and multiple applications or services, it's helpful to know where they came from, and it's helpful to be able to search on that. So if we think about a data point and what our metrics used to look like, there used to be a name, a what is it, and a value, how much is it, and then obviously a timestamp of when it happened. But the more important part that we need in our metrics these days is to have metadata, to have tags of where it is, what application it's from, where in the world is that sitting. That allows us to slice and dice our applications and our systems. So rather than just looking at a dashboard or a chart that gives me aggregated metrics, I can now ask questions against my systems. I can get that observability that I need. So I can ask it, for example, show me the CPU usage or the requests per second of my web application that's sitting in US East 1A that's running on a T2 small. Start to dial in the information that we can actually get from our systems. When you have query-based monitoring, as I mentioned, that's what gives you observability. Observability isn't just this buzzword that's come about. Observability really does mean that. It means what is visible in your system, what questions can you ask. And if you don't have that tagging and that filtering, there aren't very many questions that you can ask. The fourth quality that we need in our metrics is that they absolutely have to be long-lived. We have to keep our metrics around in order to see patterns and trends. So if we're looking at, for example, how long, if we're using public cloud, well, if we're using CloudWatch, they're the leader at 15 months, but they do a roll-up. So as we saw, that granularity actually plays and works hand in hand with your retention. If you roll up to 1 hour increments, even though you can see that data 15 months later, how useful is it at 1 hour? As we saw with the roll-up with that graph, even in 5 minutes, you lose a lot. So at Datadog, we like to keep things around in the granularity you send it to us in. So 1 second for 15 months. But if you're running your own systems, consider how long you're actually keeping things. As mentioned before, storage is cheap. You can keep things around for a lot longer than you think you can. So those are the 4 qualities of good metrics. But how should we actually think about our metrics? Well, at Datadog, we like to place them essentially in 2 buckets, and then events being sort of a third related category. I particularly love donuts. So I'm going to use the example of a donut factory. If I have a donut factory, my primary metric has to be my work metrics. My work metrics being the things that are important to my business, which is how many donuts can I sell? How many donuts can I sell then obviously relates to how many donuts can I produce? How many of them are good donuts with proper glaze, and how many of them are poorly glazed and I just have to throw away? The underlying metrics that I have around that are what I call resource metrics. They're things like, how much flour do I have? How much sugar do I have? Do I have enough of the things that make donuts, that operate my line, that I can keep working? And then events. Events aren't actually metrics, but events are the things that help us understand what's going on in our systems. So National Donut Day is a great event. You should all participate next year. But it means that we're all going to be buying donuts. That will impact my donut factory. If everybody's buying more donuts, I need to ramp up production. Similarly, with our systems, this will be things like code changes, scaling events, anything that could actually affect the systems that my applications are running on that will inform me of why my application might be performing poorly or why it might actually be performing better. But I need to know these things in order to learn about my systems and to learn from any failure scenarios or any other scenarios that happen. Once we have these, then we can start to recurse down and find the problems within our system. So we take that work metric, that high-level business metric, and we see the underlying resource metrics that support that. And then you try to correlate any sort of events that happen around that. But the thing about resources is resources do become work metrics. So for a leader in my organization, they might be alerted on that work metric that donuts are not being produced. But the underlying resource metrics of things like having enough flour or enough sugar, well, that's a work metric for my baker. Similarly, with our systems, our high-level business metrics are important for the leaders in our organizations. But the developers who end up building the services that we're on, they should get alerts when those services go down. But those services are supported by components. So if you have a data store behind that, if that data store goes down, that's a work metric for your DB team. And ultimately, that DB runs on a server. That's a work metric for your SRE or your ops team. Now notice when I had that chart, it does branch off. A lot of people try to do root cause analysis. Have you ever looked at roots? There's no singular root. We work on complex systems, as I said before, which means there's going to be a lot of collaborating components, a lot of factors in our failures. Try not to focus in on one particular root cause, because often it'll mean that you're missing out on other information. That other information oftentimes is the human element. Complex systems are complex because humans are complex. So let's talk about the human side of running a postmortem. The first thing that we should know about that is that if you're still responding to an incident, don't try to run a postmortem. If you're an engineer or a developer and you're trying to solve a problem, don't be distracted. You can learn from things later, but your primary goal as you're in an incident is to fix that incident, get things back and running. With that said, who should be part of a postmortem? It's really easy to say everybody, right? Something went wrong, everybody to get together, but who is everybody? So the way that I like to frame this to ensure that we actually do capture everybody who's important is to think of things as a crime scene investigator. You become the detective in this incident. If we think of things as a crime scene, well, I as a detective, if I showed up to a crime scene, I wouldn't just talk to the police, right? The police are the first responders. Your first responders are your engineers, your developers who are first addressing the issue. And we don't want to just stop with them. So just like a detective, rather than just talking to the police, I want to talk to the witnesses. So the witnesses, the people who identified whatever went wrong with your system. That could be customers, it could be internal users of your application, but those people are important. They have a unique perspective into the issues that happened, and they can provide you details about how it affected them, which will help you build better applications. Similarly, if I were a detective, I wouldn't just talk to the first responders and the witnesses, but I want to talk to the victim. So the victims are your affected users. So talk to the people that were directly affected. Again, these could be internal customers, external customers, but you want to talk to everybody who witnessed or was affected by your incident. So we know who we want to talk to. What do we want to collect? Well, we really want to collect their perspective. We want to know not only what people did, but what they were thinking at the time, and why they thought what they thought, or why they did what they did, what information was at hand. When it comes down to blameless postmortems, the real motivation that John Allspaw had wasn't that really we want to avoid responsibility or blame. It was the notion that people try to do the best work that they can. We all try to go to work and think, we're going to have a great day, we're going to be productive, and when something goes wrong, it's usually because we didn't have the information that we needed. And providing that information is one of the first steps to building better systems. And that's what we're trying to learn in postmortems. So gathering people's perspectives and what they thought, understanding what information was at hand, and then planning to change that in the future and provide more information is critical. As you start to gather information from people, it's often easy to just have a chat with people, pull them aside, gather their thoughts and their stories. But I love this quote from Richard Gwendon that says, writing is nature's way of letting us know how sloppy our thinking is. Because when we write things down, our logical gaps become really apparent as we write our stories. So have people write down their stories rather than just having a dialogue about them. Another thing to do, though, as people are writing their stories, is include pictures. We've heard this, pictures are worth 1,000 words. But it's really clear when you're talking about an incident, if I were to tell you, I saw a spike in latency, what does that mean? But if I showed you a spike in latency, if I took a screenshot of the dashboard and you could actually see it, that gives you a really clear picture as to what was going on. So we know the who and the what. Let's talk about the when. The when is as soon as possible. I know it's often a problem when you're trying to run postmortems and then something happens in your system and you're like, do I write about that? But I've got to build this new feature, I've got to set up this new server. Can't I just get on with my life? The problem here is that your memory drops off significantly. The very first study of human memory was done in the 1880s by a German researcher named Ebbinghaus. And he, because he was the first researcher, got to name things after himself. So we have a thing called the Ebbinghaus curve. The Ebbinghaus curve is essentially a logarithmic curve that says that roughly about 2 days after an event, we've lost most of our memory of it. So if you're waiting 2 days, if you're waiting over the weekend to run a postmortem, there's not a whole lot of difference between waiting those 2 days and waiting a month. So try to get things done within the first 2 days. Obviously, within the first 20 minutes is when you're going to have most of that memory. A good way to actually do this is to get our project managers involved. Your project managers are the ones that are driving you to build those new features, to set up those new servers or that new infrastructure. But they should understand the importance as well of running postmortems. So get them involved, have them block out some time so you can actually spend time to do these. Now, I do say try to do this as quickly as possible, but do understand that incidents are stressful. They suck. So people are under a lot of stress. Try to be aware of that. Don't rush into postmortems if someone's under stress. Or worse, if they've stayed up all night dealing with an issue, they probably have some sleep deprivation. If this is a recurring issue, they probably have some burnout. So be humane, be kind to your coworkers or the people that are working under you when you're running postmortems. Give them time to recover. Send them home, have them get some sleep. One of the things that I absolutely love in the world is Texas barbecue. Recently, Franklin's Barbecue in Austin had a big fire, and I love the response from Aaron Franklin, who's widely noted as one of the best barbecue masters in the world. He gave his employee a bottle of whiskey and said, go home, get some sleep, come back in the morning, it'll be okay. One of the other things to keep aware of as we have stress and burnout and issues like that is that we do have data skew. Just like we have data corruption in systems, we have data skew as humans, and being humans, data skew is usually worse than with systems. Data skew can happen in a lot of ways. I have already mentioned blameless postmortems, but blame is the #1 way that we get data skew. If I accuse you of doing something wrong, if I make you fearful that you're going to lose your job, you're not going to tell me the truth. I really need that truth. I need that accurate picture of what happened. So avoid blame. Avoid threatening people with a loss of a job or removed responsibilities. But there are a lot of other biases that we have. There's a Wikipedia page on human bias, and it's just got a list of hundreds of biases. The most common that come into play when we think of postmortems are things like anchoring, placing too much weight on one particular fact as we ignore others. Hindsight bias is another really huge one as we deal with postmortems. Anytime you ask somebody, why didn't you do this? Or shouldn't you have seen that? That's hindsight bias. You're setting up an alternate reality of the world. You're imagining that they had information that they didn't have at the time. So if you find yourself asking, well, why didn't my coworker do this? First ask, what information did they have? Why did they think that what they did was okay? Or why didn't they do an action because they were missing some information? What was that information? Because that's the key for you. Outcome bias is another big one that we deal with a lot with postmortems. Outcome bias ties the good or bad value of my decision or my action to the good or bad outcome that happened. My great example of this is, I've mentioned whiskey a few times. I really do enjoy whiskey. I could go out right now and drink a bunch of whiskey and go driving all around town and not get into an accident. That's still a really bad decision. Don't go drunk driving. Even though you might not get caught, you might not crash, the actions that we take are often unrelated to the outcomes. Similarly, I can go out and drive sober, and I can get into an accident. That doesn't mean that driving sober is a bad decision. So try to disconnect the things that happen from the decisions that people make. There are a number of other biases here. Availability, we tend to place more weight on things that we remember that have happened more recently. Try to avoid that, because oftentimes that'll lead you to the wrong conclusions or have you performing the wrong actions. Just because things look similar, be aware that they may not be similar. And then bandwagoning. Don't get caught up with the bandwagon. If everybody's going along and you see something that's different, say something about it. Make that information known. The goal of postmortems, again, is to learn, so we want as much information as we can. So with all that said, I want to jump into how we do postmortems at Datadog. We run very complex systems, and we do have postmortems. We do them regularly. It makes it easier, it makes our systems better, it helps us learn a lot. So a few notes of what we do at Datadog is we do email our postmortems company-wide. So everybody in the organization has access to our postmortems. This is particularly helpful not just in engineering, but if you think of people that are affected, they might want to know why a system went out. If you think of people that deal with your customers might want to know why your service was degraded. So providing that information is really helpful for everybody across an organization, more than just engineering. We also schedule a monthly recurring postmortem meeting. So we can all get together and learn from things. Because when a postmortem happens in one team, another team may not necessarily know about it. So getting together on a monthly basis makes this a less stressful event. It makes it something regular where we can just understand that we're coming together to learn, and we can learn from each other. So in our postmortem template, we really have 5 main sections, and the first is a summary of what happened. So when we describe what happened, this is often what most people read when we email the postmortems company-wide. But it really just has a description of what happened at a very high level. And then we ask 4 questions. What was the impact on customers? So again, keeping those work metrics or that work business goal primary to what we're learning about. Then we ask, what was the severity of the outage? You want to run postmortems not just for your critical outages. You want to run them for your medium incidents and your small ones too. As we start to learn and improve our systems, those small learnings will build up and help us create better systems. The third question that we ask is, what components were affected? So we want to know, where in our systems was this problem? And then finally, we ask what resolved the outage. So we want to know, at a high level, about what our solution was. So this is a little bit of a postmortem that we ran about a year ago. We had an outage. We have the description here that we lost some capacity. There was increased latency and 500 errors. But again, as I mentioned, a picture's worth 1,000 words. I can say that we had increased latency, but we can see this graph from Pingdom. That's really an increase in latency. And we can see that not only is it just a one-time increase, but it's going up and down. So that gives us a much better picture of what was happening. And then we ask these 4 questions. So what was the impact on our customers? Well, in this case, our customers were shown a down page, and that means that the severity was major. It's a critical outage. What components were affected? So we have our internal system called McNulty and snapshots, and some of our crawlers went down. And then ultimately what resolved it was that we bumped up a size within AWS. So we got some more capacity there, and that actually helped resolve it. The second part of our postmortem template is, how was the outage detected? Because really, when it comes to learning, it's about how can we get better? How can we not only improve the resiliency, but resiliency means that when something goes down, we bring it back up faster. So we want to make sure that we're getting faster at this. So we ask, did we have a metric that showed this outage? We want to be monitoring these things. Was there a monitor on that metric? Are we receiving the automated alerts? Because none of us are going to be just staring at dashboards all day waiting for that outage to happen. We want that automated notification. And then we ask, how long did it take for us to declare an outage? So we want to acknowledge when things happen, and we want to be really fast at doing so. If I jump into our postmortem, how was the outage detected? Well, we did have a number of metrics, including things in AWS and within our own systems. And we did have automated notifications on that. We had a number of them went off. And so it took us roughly 3 minutes to declare an outage on this particular incident. And again, along with that, we included a number of graphs, because pictures being worth 1,000 words, we not only have that pingdom graph, but we can see our latency in AWS ELB right there in front, or on the top in the middle. We can see latency on our stream, which is on the top right. So we can clearly see that we've got an incident here. The third part of our postmortem template that we ask is, how did we respond? So this is where we start to gather some of that human data. So we ask, who was the incident owner? Who took control of the situation? And who else was involved? So this, again, is where we ask that everybody question. And we start to think of, who are the responders? Who are the people affected? Who are the people that witnessed this? Other things that we include here is a link to Slack. We have an archive, and we start to build out a timeline. And then we ask two final questions in this section. What went well? Because we want to reward and promote the good practices that we have, the things that have been really beneficial. And we ask, what didn't go so well? We want to identify the practices and the approaches that had some friction. So as I jump into our postmortem, well, how did we respond? Well, in this particular incident, Jeff was the owner. First responders, we had a group of them. We have a link to our Slack archives and also to our dashboards here. So if you have any dashboards that provide the ability to give you a link to a particular time, those are pretty helpful. We also have a link to our Notebooks feature. Notebooks is a feature within Datadog that allows you to embed actual interactive graphs with text. But it really could be anything for your group. It could be Google Docs, where you include screenshots. It could be any place that you want to record that information and record those dashboards so you can understand what was going on. And then we have our timeline of events. So just a basic high-level overview of that timeline. Now, I did mention that we've got Slack, the archive link to Slack. If you're using any sort of chat ops tool, Slack, HipChat, IRC, if you're like hardcore old school sysadmins, save those. Try to do all of your work that you can within a chat. I know it's really easy for a lot of people to do the war room style, to gather everybody up and go into a meeting room and set that up as your war room. Or maybe if you're a cool company with a NOC with the big screens, you go into the NOC because big screens are cool. The problem, though, is you lose a lot of that information. What did I say to you 5 minutes ago? I think I was telling you about our load balancer, but I can't quite remember. When you have everything in Slack, it's all recorded. So it's really easy. You automatically have a timeline of those events. You just have to point to them. Now, I know that I said you shouldn't try to do a postmortem while you were resolving your issue. But one thing that is really helpful, especially if you use Slack or HipChat or some other chat ops tool, is it's really easy just to write down a note, hashtag it, put a keyword on it, and then search for those later. So in this case, if Dan didn't get paged on an event, and he should have, he's in Slack. He could just say, hey, didn't get paged. I don't have to deal with that now. By now, Dan knows about the incident, and he's working on it. But when he comes back to this later, he can remember that. He can search for that hashtag of postmortem, remember, oh yeah, I didn't get paged. Let's add that as a task. Put me in that pager duty rotation. The fourth section of our template is we ask, why did it happen? This is really the guts of it. It's where we do the deep dive into the technical reasons of what went wrong. So in this particular postmortem, I'm not going to go into it. It's really interesting, though. That's a link to our status page, which has a deeper explanation. And then actually, Alexi, our CTO, actually did a meetup presentation on what went wrong for this particular incident. It's an interesting case study of VMs and how VMs process work. And then finally, the fifth section of our postmortem template is the most important. And that fifth section is really, how do we prevent this in the future? How do we get better, build better systems? So we break this down into really 3 sections that we call now, next, and later. Now is the things that we absolutely have to do right now. We have to prioritize this work and do it immediately. Otherwise, this incident will happen again. Next is things that we can set aside and do them in the next sprint cycle. We want to be sure that they get done. We want to do them quickly, but they don't necessarily need to happen immediately. And then later is for anything that might take some extra work or might take some team collaboration. Oftentimes when we build complex systems, if we're building multiple services, it may take some coordination with other services or other teams. So you don't want to forget about those. You do want to work with those teams, but it's going to take some time to sync up your timetables, to get everybody's work queue in alignment in order to be able to work on those and make those serious changes. Now, an important thing here is that you have to link to your GitHub issues. You have to link to your Trello cards or your Jira tickets. Keep track of your work. Keep track of the things that you have to do. Otherwise, they will slide off of your radar. You'll just get caught up in that next thing you have to build or that next feature that you want to deploy. So if I jump into our postmortem, looking here, how do we prevent it in the future? Well, we had really two tasks. The first one got done by Mira and Kyle. We have links to the Trello cards and the GitHub commit. And then we also have a second issue that didn't get done. And including notes in your postmortems is very important. In this case, we did have a note here that Mira noted it wasn't particularly applicable as she investigated the issue. So keeping notes along with your cards or along with your postmortems are key, so you can track those learnings as things get tackled. So just to recap, there are 5 sections in our postmortem template. The first is the what happened, that high-level summary, the thing that you can share across your organization so everybody's learning. The second is how did you detect it? You want to get faster. You want to get better at this process. So make note of the metrics that you have, the automated alerts that you have. Create them if you don't have them. The third is how did you respond? This is where you gather that human element. Talk to everybody that was involved, the responders and the people who were affected. Gather their stories, gather the information that they had at the time, what they understood about the system. The fifth is the deep dive. Go deep. Go as deep as you can. Find out those issues. Learn a lot about your systems and the systems that you're running. And then the final one is the action steps. Make sure you have good, actionable next steps. Track them in whatever system you're using to track your tickets and ensure that they get done. Take those notes if need be. So more resources that are available. I know I just mentioned this postmortem template, but I do have it available as a Google Doc, so feel free to hit that link, make a copy of it, start using it within your own organization. I've added some notes along with each section, so that should help you understand what the section's about, help you provide some more of that information. And then a friend of mine, Jason Hand, who works at VictorOps, has recently published a book called Post-Incident Reviews. He really hates it when I say postmortems because he thinks that it's a bit morbid. So Post-Incident Reviews is what he calls it, but it's a great read, so I highly recommend that you go there and you download that book. And with that, I'm open for questions. Yeah, up here.
How long does it typically take to get a postmortem together, and who is actually contributing to that?
Yeah, so the question is, how long does it take to get a postmortem together, and who is actually contributing to the document? So for us, usually when I see postmortems getting emailed, it's within a few days, and you know that they try to create the postmortem within the first couple days, but oftentimes that then gets sent around within the team for everybody else to add their information, do a little bit of editing, and then they send it out. So yeah, usually within that first 2 days, and then the people involved really is that the first responders, so all the engineers that were involved, and then oftentimes anybody else that might have been a part of that incident. So we also do have an outage channel in Slack. A lot of people will jump in there. A lot of times those people will also contribute. I see another question up here in the front.
Yes, so do you guys have any automation or tool that stores all the postmortems that you guys have?
So the question is, do we have any sort of tool that stores all of the postmortems that we do? So at this point, we do some of our postmortems in our notebooks, which do get stored in Datadog. But most of our postmortems actually these days are Google Docs, and so we just have a giant folder with all of them. We also have an interesting Trello board. So for those who aren't familiar with Trello, Trello's a Kanban style tracker. So you have columns and you have cards. It makes a giant grid. Alexia has actually created a Kanban board sort of style thing for our postmortems. So all of the postmortems essentially become cards, and every column is a month. And it gives him a nice high-level overview to see what's gone on in a month, start to be able to visualize if there's any sort of pattern. So I think he color codes them around components or around the topics. But it gives them a good, fast way to see what the count is and what they're about. And as we get better, hopefully we have less of those.
As a follow-up to that, as you know, automation kind of like decreases the friction to adoption. Right? So what are some advice to us about wanting to organizations?
Yeah, so the question, as I understand it, is automation helps reduce friction. Is there any automated way that we can sort of do postmortems or start to automate the learnings? That's a good question. I don't have any tools that actually automate this. It really does come down for us to having the people start to do it and making that process really just a habit and a practice that everybody just knows when there's an issue, you've got to do a postmortem. So it really just has become habit. I see a hand back there in the middle. Also, I'm getting a flashing 5 sign, so we got 5 minutes left. So the question is, since we email postmortems across the company, does that make people want to be less honest? No, not from what I've seen, and I think that's largely a cultural issue, is that we do have a culture that's really blameless, that understands that things happen, and so people are generally really honest about what's gone on, and that just leads to more honesty within our company culture. So, as you understand, when people are honest and when nobody's blaming you and when nobody gets reprimanded or has responsibilities taken away, it makes it easier for you to be honest. And it also, as you see that and you see other people being very honest about, hey, I did this thing because I thought it was okay, here's the information I had. When I see that and then I have an outage, I do naturally have that tendency of like, that was a dumb move. But as I think about it and as I look at our practices, it becomes much easier to be like, that it was kind of dumb, but I didn't have that information and I'm just going to own that and send that out. So building those good cultures definitely plays into that. Up here in the front. Oop. Yeah. That just went the wrong way. You probably want that one? Or did you want... Okay, yeah.
Second, this sounds like a great process, but it also sounds like time-consuming potentially. How long do you spend on each one of these postmortems? How much of your time overall do you spend doing postmortems? How do you sell this to management and say that's how they about it?
Yeah, so the question is, how much time does it take to actually do these? Because it sounds like it takes a lot of time. Generally, they do take a fair bit of time to run. I have noticed that over the past probably the past year, since I've been studying postmortems and working on this talk, people have gotten a little bit lax about filling out all the sections in great detail, but they do hit the main points. So it really comes down to a balance. Ideally, selling it to management as not being a time waste is that if we're learning about our systems and these help us to build better systems and stay more reliable because we know the faults in our systems and we can address them, then overall it's going to be a good thing. So it is that balance of, well, do you want me to spend an hour on it now or 2 hours on it now? Or as I mentioned for the calculations of downtime, assuming you're a medium-sized business, is it worth an hour of downtime later that's going to cost us $200,000? Any other questions? No? All right. Well, I'm going to throw my info back up here just in case you do have questions. Feel free to hit me up on Twitter, and I'll stick around. Thanks.